The empty corridors of the Keras 9 station market hummed with the noise of old ventilation fans. The metallic drone echoed through the cavernous space, bouncing off walls stained with decades of grime and industrial residue. Steam hissed from overworked pipes that snaked along the ceiling like mechanical veins, occasionally releasing droplets of condensation that rained down on the scattered merchants and desperate scavengers below. 4-year-old Bennett, wrapped in a worn jacket too large for her small frame, crawled between piles of metal scrap. Her thin, blue-tinged fingers probed through the debris, selecting the sturdiest pieces with practiced precision. She didn't need sight to recognize value. Her sensitive touch had become her most valuable asset in this harsh world. Each fragment told a story through its texture, weight, and resonance when tapped against other metals. "Digging through the purple trash again, little one," a mocking voice called from above. The merchant Varnick leaned over his stall, his breath reeking of synthetic alcohol and processed protein. His heavy boots, patched with mismatched leather, stopped inches from Bennett's hand, and she recoiled instinctively. Bennett's cloudy, pale eyes, characteristic of her Aryan heritage, stared blankly ahead as she clutched a small metal plate in her hand, the sum total of 3 weeks of scavenging. This single piece could save her life and buy a day's worth of food. The plate had a peculiar resonance when struck, suggesting it contained rare metals that the station's recycling units had somehow missed. She tucked the plate into her pocket and continued her search, ignoring the taunt from the station vendor who had long ago stopped seeing her as a child and now viewed her as merely another scavenger, another desperate soul in the vast machinery of Keras 9. The marketplace around her buzzed with the sounds of haggling, the clash of metal on metal, and the constant drone of the station's life support systems fighting to maintain breathable air. Voices in a dozen languages created a linguistic tapestry, human dialects mixing with the melodic tones of Orient speech and the guttural clicks of Drevnian traders. Credits exchanged hands. Goods were inspected with suspicious eyes, and security drones occasionally buzzed overhead, their sensors sweeping the crowds for contraband or unlicensed weapons. Keras 9 had once been a thriving waypoint for interstellar travelers, a jewel in the crown of the Terran expansion. Holographic advertisements still flickered feebly from some walls, showing smiling families in pristine corridors that had never existed outside of corporate propaganda. But decades of neglect had transformed it into a refuge for those with nowhere else to go. Humans cast adrift from Earth colonies, alien species fleeing wars or persecution, and orphans like Bennett, forgotten in the chaos of a universe too busy to care. The station had been built in the aftermath of the First Contact War, when humanity was still high on the euphoria of discovering they weren't alone in the universe. Designed as a symbol of interspecies cooperation, it had instead become a monument to failed policies and corporate greed. The upper levels still housed administrative offices and luxury apartments for visiting dignitaries who rarely came anymore. The middle levels, where Bennett now scavenged, were a maze of markets, warehouses, and cramped living quarters. And below, in the engineering sectors and waste management facilities, lived those who could afford nothing better: refugees, criminals, and the truly desperate. The bitter smell of synthetic food and unwashed bodies assaulted her sensitive nostrils. Despite her blindness, Bennett's other senses had developed to an extraordinary degree. She could identify most of the station's inhabitants by their distinct odors and the cadence of their footsteps. The heavy tread approaching from her left belonged to Morkel, a trader known for his cruelty toward child scavengers. She quickly shifted direction, moving deeper into the twisted maze of discarded technology, her small hands and feet finding purchase in spaces too tight for adults to follow. Her world was one of constant vigilance, of learning which sounds meant safety and which signaled danger. The whir of security drones meant hiding. The specific buzz of the recycling units meant potential scavenging opportunities. The lowered voices of station security presaged raids and arrests. Bennett had learned these lessons through painful experience, through hunger and fear, and the occasional kindness of strangers who saw in her a reflection of their own lost innocence. "Stand aside." A rough shove sent Bennett tumbling into a heap of discarded wiring. A group of station security guards pushed through the crowd, their heavy boots clanging against the metal flooring. Their uniforms, once crisp blue and silver, had faded to dull gray, but the weapons at their hips were well maintained, a telling indication of the station administration's priorities. She froze, pressing her small body against the wall. The station administration had been rounding up unregistered children for deportation, and Bennett had evaded capture for months. Rumors whispered in the darkened corridors spoke of labor camps on distant moons, of children's small fingers valued for their ability to reach delicate machinery, of promises of education and care that dissolved into exploitation and neglect. Her heart pounded against her ribs, the vibrations of approaching footsteps making her skin crawl. She scrambled deeper into the junk pile, cutting her hands on jagged edges, but pain was preferable to capture. Warm blood trickled between her fingers, its coppery scent filling her nostrils. The security team passed, their conversation drifting back to her sensitive ears. Another sweep of the lower levels tonight, one was saying. Administrator Reeves wants all unregistered dependents processed by the end of the cycle. Waste of resources, another replied. Most of them won't survive the transport anyway. Their callous words faded as they moved away, leaving Bennett shaking in her hiding place. The security team passed, and Bennett exhaled slowly, allowing herself to relax just enough to continue her work. She had become adept at making herself invisible, at existing in the spaces between, not human enough for the human sectors, not Orient enough for the few Orient refugees who clustered together for protection. Her mixed heritage, visible in her blue-tinged skin and cloudy eyes, made her an outsider to both species. The wound on her palm stung, but she had endured worse. Survival on Karis 9 had taught her that pain was simply another sensation to be cataloged and managed. She wrapped a scrap of cloth around her cut palm and resumed her search, fingers trembling slightly from hunger and fear. The metal plate in her pocket pressed against her thigh, a small comfort in a world that offered few. Through the din of commerce, a calm, sober voice cut through the noise. "Are you lost?" Bennett jerked back, startled by the proximity of the voice. It belonged to a human. She could tell from the lack of resonance that characterized Orient speech. A tall man in worn work coveralls stood before her. His face was gaunt, but his eyes were attentive and warm. Eldred had watched the child for days, noticing how she navigated the market with uncanny precision despite her blindness, how she avoided the security patrols, how no one claimed her. He extended his hand, but Bennett retreated, distrustful of strangers. Survival had taught her that kindness often came with hidden costs. Her back pressed against the cold metal wall, trapping her between the human and the hard surface. Panic fluttered in her chest like a captured bird. Her fingers instinctively sought escape routes, finding only smooth metal and the unyielding presence of the man before her. "Hungry?" Eldred asked, his voice deliberately gentle. There was something in his tone, a sadness perhaps or a weariness, that made Bennett pause. Unlike the harsh voices that usually addressed her, his carried no threat, no demand. It reminded her of something just beyond the reach of memory, a voice from her earliest years perhaps, before Karis 9 became her entire world. Bennett's stomach betrayed her with a loud growl. It had been 2 days since her last meal, a discarded protein pack she'd found near the waste processing unit. The gnawing emptiness inside her had become a constant companion, dulling her thoughts and slowing her movements. Sometimes in the quiet hours when the station's artificial night cycle dimmed the lights, the hunger was so intense it brought tears to her eyes, though she never allowed herself to cry. Tears were a waste of precious moisture. Eldred purchased warm food from one of the stalls, placing it on the ground between them rather than forcing it upon her. "It's yours," he said, stepping back to give her space. No strings attached. The aroma of real protein, not synthetic but actual meat, wafted toward Bennett, making her mouth water painfully. The richness of the scent told her this wasn't the processed nutrient paste distributed in the refugee sectors, but real food, the kind sold in the upper-level markets where she rarely dared to venture. Still, she hesitated. In her short life, she had learned that nothing was truly free. Every gift had a price, every kindness a hidden agenda. But hunger proved stronger than caution. Bennett clutched her metal plate fearfully as she edged forward, her other hand outstretched until her fingers found the container. She ate in silence, swallowing each bite as if it might be her last. The warm food hit her empty stomach like a shock, almost painful in its intensity. Eldred watched, his eyes scanning the crowd for security patrols. He noted the methodical way she ate. No wasted motion, no spilled food, each bite carefully chewed and swallowed. It wasn't the frantic eating of a starving child, but the disciplined consumption of someone who had learned to make every mouthful count. Her small frame spoke of chronic malnutrition, her movements of constant vigilance. Yet there was dignity in how she held herself, a quiet determination that suggested an inner strength beyond her years. "Where are your parents?" he asked when she had finished. Bennett merely shrugged, her face impassive. She had no memory of parents, only of the cold corridors and the constant search for sustenance. Somewhere in the recesses of her mind lurked fragmented memories. A gentle touch, a musical voice singing in the Orient language, the sensation of being held. But these were so faint they might have been dreams. Sometimes in the moments between wakefulness and sleep, she imagined a woman with blue skin and silver-flecked hair, humming melodies that made the air vibrate in strange patterns. But when she reached for these images, they dissolved like mist, leaving her with nothing but an aching emptiness that hunger couldn't explain. "My name's Eldred," he said, crouching down to her level. "I work in the maintenance sector. I could use a small assistant, someone who knows the hidden spaces of this station." The maintenance sector meant access to restricted areas, to parts of the station where security rarely patrolled. It meant warm air vents to sleep near and discarded tools that could be traded for food. Bennett tilted her head, considering the offer. For a blind half-Orient orphan, there were few options on Karis 9, and fewer still that didn't involve exploitation or abuse. Eldred saw the calculation in her expression. Too adult, too weary for such a young face. "I have quarters in the engineering section," he continued. "Small but clean. You'd have your own sleep space, regular meals." He paused, then added more softly, "Safety." That last word resonated more deeply than he could know. Safety was a luxury Bennett had never experienced, a concept as foreign to her as color or distant stars. She opened her mouth to respond when a sudden commotion erupted nearby. Two armed security guards had spotted her, recognizing the orphan child the administration had been hunting for deportation. "There, the half-breed," one shouted, pointing in their direction. "Authorization code 87 Delta, unregistered dependent for processing." Their orders were clear. All non-registered minors were to be processed and shipped to the labor colonies on Proxima 7, where their small fingers would be put to work in the mineral extraction facilities. Few children survived more than a year in those hellish conditions. The mines consumed them, grinding their small bodies to dust in the relentless pursuit of profit. Eldred quickly assessed the threat and scooped Bennett into his arms, her tiny frame weighing almost nothing against his chest. Years of malnutrition had stunted her growth, making her appear younger than her actual age. Her heart fluttered against his like a trapped bird, but she made no sound, no cry of fear or protest. Even in this moment of danger, she maintained the silence that had kept her alive on the station. "Hold on," he whispered, and plunged into a narrow ventilation shaft barely wide enough for his shoulders. The metal walls scraped against his shoulders as he crawled forward, the sound echoing painfully in Bennett's sensitive ears. The hum of ventilators mixed with the shouts of pursuing guards as they navigated through the station's forgotten arteries. Bennett's arms wrapped around Eldred's neck, her breath coming in frightened gasps, but she made no sound. Fear was a luxury that survival couldn't afford. The ventilation system of Karis 9 was a labyrinthine network of shafts and tunnels, originally designed with maintenance in mind, but long since abandoned to jury-rigged repairs and makeshift patches. Some sections still functioned as intended, circulating the recycled air that kept the station's inhabitants alive. Others had been sealed off due to damage or repurposed by those seeking to move through the station unseen. Smugglers, fugitives, and the desperate. "Left at the junction," she whispered, surprising Eldred. Though blind, she had mapped these tunnels through touch and sound during her solitary explorations. Her knowledge of the station's hidden pathways exceeded that of most adults who had lived there for years. Eldred followed her directions without question, trusting her instincts even as the sounds of pursuit grew closer. The shaft narrowed further, forcing him to wriggle through on his belly, pushing Bennett ahead of him. The metal grew hot beneath their bodies. They were passing near one of the station's reactor cooling systems. The heat intensified as they crawled forward, sweat beading on Eldred's forehead and soaking through his coveralls. For Bennett, the rising temperature manifested as waves of distortion in the sounds around her, the metal walls expanding and contracting with soft creaks that mapped the invisible world. She navigated by these subtle cues, guiding them away from sections where the heat might become dangerous. "Cover your ears," Bennett warned, just before a deafening hiss of steam erupted from a vent beside them. The scalding vapor missed them by inches, but the noise would mask their movements from the guards. The periodic venting of excess pressure was part of the station's operational rhythm, as familiar to Bennett as her own heartbeat. She had learned to predict these eruptions, to feel the subtle vibrations that preceded them, and to use them to her advantage when evading those who meant her harm. They continued through the maze of tunnels, Bennett's directions becoming more confident as they moved deeper into the station's infrastructure. The sounds of pursuit faded behind them, replaced by the omnipresent hum of machinery and the occasional distant clanging of repair work. "How do you know these passages so well?" Eldred asked during a brief rest, his voice hushed despite the distance they had put between themselves and the security forces. Bennett's cloudy eyes turned in his direction, her expression solemn. "I listen," she said simply. And it was true. She navigated not just by touch and memory, but by the complex symphony of sounds that permeated the station. Each sector had its acoustic signature, each junction its unique pattern of echoes and reverberations. They emerged into a dimly lit compartment where blue lights flickered, casting eerie shadows. A group of Orions, tall, blue-skinned aliens with elongated limbs, surrounded them instantly. The leader of the group, a young female warrior named Sarah, pointed her weapon directly at Eldred's chest. Her violet eyes narrowed with suspicion, reflecting the azure emergency lighting. The blade in her hand was curved and serrated, designed not just to cut, but to inflict maximum damage. A weapon for those who could not afford to leave enemies behind. "What do you want here?" she demanded, her voice musical despite the threat it carried. The Orion language had evolved in a world of dense forests and constant winds where sound traveled in unpredictable patterns. As a result, their speech had developed complex tonal qualities that conveyed meaning beyond the mere words themselves. Even when speaking human languages, this musicality remained, giving their voices a distinctive cadence that Bennett found strangely comforting. Eldred explained their situation, still breathing heavily from the escape. "The station's security is hunting her. They're rounding up children for deportation to the mining colonies." Bennett trembled against his chest, burying her face in his shoulder. The Orions were feared throughout the station. Rumors of their strength and combat prowess kept most humans at a distance. But Bennett could sense something familiar in their presence, a resonance that called to her mixed heritage. The air in this section tasted different, humid and rich with unfamiliar scents. Bennett detected the aromatic herbs that the Orions cultivated in hidden hydroponic chambers, the distinctive oils they used on their weapons and tools, and the subtle musk of their blue skin. These smells triggered fragments of memory, disconnected images and sensations from her earliest years, before the station became her entire world. Syra's luminous eyes studied the human man, then shifted to the child in his arms. She lowered her blade slightly, noticing the blue tinge to Bennett's skin and the characteristic cloudy eyes of Orion hybrids, born with the genetic blindness that sometimes resulted from human-Orion pairings. "She is one of our kind," Sarah said softly, reaching out to touch Bennett's face with a gentle finger. At least partially. The touch was electric, skin recognizing skin on some fundamental level that transcended species. Bennett flinched initially, then leaned almost imperceptibly into the contact, her body responding to a connection she didn't consciously remember. "You bring station security to our doorstep," another Orion demanded, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife. His name was Torvin, and he had lost his entire family during the evacuation of their homeworld. His distrust of humans ran deep, carved into him by grief and reinforced by years of persecution. "They were already hunting both of us," Eldred replied, "and soon they'll hunt you too." This caught Sayera's attention. She lowered her weapon further, her expression shifting from hostility to concern. "Explain." "The administration is planning a forced evacuation of all Orions into open space," Eldred revealed. "I've seen the documents while repairing the comm system. They're preparing to vent the lower sectors tomorrow at 0600. A murmur ran through the Orions. Their community had been living in the shadows of Karis 9 for years, refugees from their war-torn homeworld. The station represented their last chance for survival. After the destruction of Aurea Prime during the Resource Wars, the survivors had scattered across the galaxy, seeking refuge wherever they could find it. Some had been welcomed, but most, like those on Karis 9, existed in a precarious state of toleration, their status subject to the changing winds of political convenience. "Why would they do this?" Sarah asked, though the answer was clear in her eyes. Tensions between humans and Orions had been escalating throughout the sector. The Terran Protectorate had declared all Orions potential security threats after a series of bombings on Earth colonies. Bombings that many believed had been false flag operations designed to justify aggression against the resource-rich Orion homeworld. "They're calling it a purification protocol," Eldred said, his voice thick with disgust. Station Administrator Reeves signed the order himself yesterday. I was repairing a terminal in his office when the document came through. Administrator Reeves was a notorious xenophobe, appointed by a protectorate government increasingly dominated by Earth supremacist factions. His policies had gradually transformed Karis 9 from a multicultural waypoint to a stratified society where non-humans were relegated to the lowest levels and worst jobs. The purification he envisioned would not stop with the Orions. They were merely the first targets in a broader campaign of ethnic cleansing. Sarah conferred briefly with her companions before turning back to Eldred. "We will give you shelter, but we require assistance in return. You have experience with the engineering systems. You can disable the life support blocks for a counterattack." The plan was audacious. By disabling specific life support systems in the administrative sectors, they could force an evacuation of the upper levels, creating the distraction they needed to seize a transport ship and escape the station. It was a desperate gambit, with significant risks of civilian casualties, but faced with imminent extinction, the Aryans saw no alternative. Eldred nodded grimly. It wasn't a choice, it was survival. "I'll need access to the central control hub." "And the child?" Sarah asked, her gaze falling on Bennett, who had remained silent throughout the exchange. "She stays with me," Eldred said firmly. There was something protective in his voice that made Bennett look up in surprise. No one had ever spoken about her with such certainty, such commitment. Sarah studied them both, her expression unreadable. "Very well, but she is your responsibility." While the adults planned their resistance, Bennett sat quietly in the corner, her ears capturing every word, every movement, every breath. Despite her young age, she had memorized the patterns of ventilation shafts and the movements of the security guards she'd observed in the market. Her mind created maps where her eyes could not see, and these silent observations became the key to their escape plan. The Orion refugee was tucked deep within the station's maintenance levels, a series of interconnected chambers that had once housed environmental control systems. They had transformed the sterile space into something that echoed their homeworld, with fabric hangings that dampened sound and created the illusion of the forest canopies of Oria. The air was humid and carried unfamiliar spices that tickled Bennett's nose. An elderly Orion approached her, moving with the deliberate grace of his species. His skin had faded to a pale lavender with age, and his movements were slower than those of his younger companions. But there was a dignity in his bearing that commanded respect. His name was Thalen, and he had once been a renowned sonic architect on Oria Prime, designing structures that interacted with the planet's constant winds to create complex harmonies. "You have the eyes of the starblind," he said, his voice crackling with age. On Oria, such children were considered blessed by the cosmos, able to see what others could not. The term starblind was an ancient one, dating back to the earliest days of Orion civilization, when those born without sight were believed to perceive the vibrations of distant stars, information inaccessible to those limited by visual perception. While modern Orions recognized this as myth, they maintained a deep respect for those with alternative sensory frameworks. Bennett shifted uncomfortably under his attention. She had spent her life avoiding notice, becoming invisible in the shadows of Karis 9. To be seen, truly seen, was unfamiliar and frightening. The old Orion placed something in her hand, a small device that emitted a faint hum. "This is a sonic mapper," he explained. "It sends vibrations that return as echoes, helping you see obstacles before you touch them. It was designed for those like you on our homeworld." The device was an artifact from a more prosperous time, a relic of a civilization now scattered across the stars. That Thelen had preserved it through war, evacuation, and years of precarious existence spoke to its significance, both practical and cultural. It represented not just adaptive technology, but a connection to a heritage that was in danger of being lost forever. Bennett's fingers explored the device, discovering buttons and contours that seemed to fit her hand perfectly. When activated, it sent a tingle through her fingertips, translating the returning echoes into tactile sensations. Suddenly, the space around her expanded in her mind, no longer limited to what she could touch, but extending outward in a three-dimensional map of vibrations. The world transformed around her. Where before she had perceived only what her fingers could reach or her ears could hear, now she felt the shape of the room, the positions of the people within it, the texture of the walls and furnishings. It was as though she had been given a new sense, one that bridged the gap between hearing and touch. A smile, rare and fleeting, crossed her face. The old Orion patted her shoulder and moved away, leaving her to explore her new sense of the world. Across the room, Eldred watched this interaction with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Sarah approached him, her movements fluid and silent. "Why do you care for this child?" she asked bluntly. "She is not yours by blood." Eldred's gaze remained fixed on Bennett. "3 years ago, I had a family," he said quietly. "A wife, a daughter. They were on a transport to the colonies when it was attacked by pirates. No survivors." His voice caught, but he continued. "My daughter would have been her age now." The pirate attack on the colony transport Nebula Dawn had been a notorious tragedy, widely reported throughout the sector. Over 300 colonists, mostly families seeking new opportunities on the frontier worlds, had been lost when the ship's life support systems were deliberately targeted. The pirates had not even bothered to steal the cargo. It was an act of pure destruction, rumored to be a paid operation by corporate interests seeking to discourage independent colonization. Understanding dawned in Sarah's eyes. "You seek redemption through her." "I seek nothing," Eldred replied, his voice suddenly hard. "But I won't stand by and watch another child suffer when I can prevent it." "The girl is half Orion," Sarah observed. "Likely the offspring of one of our people and a human station worker. Such unions rarely end well." Mixed species relationships were viewed with suspicion by many on both sides. Humans feared dilution of their genetic heritage. Orions worried about the loss of cultural identity in a galaxy increasingly dominated by human norms. Children of such unions often found themselves caught between worlds, belonging fully to neither. "Does it matter? She's a child who needs help." Sarah's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Among my people, all children are considered the responsibility of the community. Perhaps humans and Orions are not so different in this." Their conversation was interrupted by an alarm blaring through the station's communication system. A monotone voice announced, "Security alert in sectors 7 through 12. All residents are advised to return to their registered quarters for identity verification. Non-compliance will result in immediate deportation." The automated message repeated in several languages, including the formal Orion dialect, though with pronunciation so mangled it was barely recognizable. The inclusion of Orion at all was merely a pretense of inclusivity, a facade of fairness covering the deeply discriminatory policies that govern the station. "They're searching for us," Eldred said, moving quickly to Bennett's side. Sarah's expression hardened. "Our plan must accelerate. The purification protocol may begin earlier than anticipated." The next hours were a flurry of activity as the Orions prepared for their desperate gambit. Weapons were distributed, primarily blade weapons, since energy weapons were strictly controlled on the station. Supplies were gathered and packed into portable containers. Communication devices were synchronized and emergency protocols established. Throughout this organized chaos, Bennett remained a calm center, absorbing the activity around her through her enhanced senses. The sonic mapper revealed new dimensions of her surroundings, allowing her to navigate the unfamiliar space with growing confidence. She practiced creating mental maps of the Orion refuge, memorizing the locations of exits, storage areas, and defensive positions. As the artificial night cycle descended on the station, the Orions prepared for their mission. Maps of the station's infrastructure were projected on a makeshift screen, with Eldred pointing out the critical junctions and control nodes they would need to access. "The central environmental controls are here," he explained, indicating a section near the administrative levels, "but they'll be heavily guarded. We need a diversion." "The girl stays here," Sarah commanded as the team prepared for their night raid. Eldred shook his head. "She knows the hidden pathways better than anyone. We need her." Sarah's face registered disbelief. "A blind human Orion child. She will slow us down." "Trust me," Eldred insisted. "She survived alone longer than you'd believe possible." Reluctantly, Sarah agreed, and as darkness settled over the artificial night cycle of Keras 9, the unlikely team ventured into the dark technical sector. Eldred carried Bennett on his back. but it was she who guided them, whispering directions based on the vibrations and sounds she recognized from her solitary explorations. The sonic mapper clutched in her hand provided unprecedented awareness of her surroundings, allowing her to detect security patrols long before they came into visual range. "Left here," she murmured, "hidden hatch behind the third pipe." The technical sector was a maze of maintenance tunnels, access shafts, and emergency corridors that connected the various systems that kept the station functioning. Most station residents, even those who had lived on Keras 9 for years, knew nothing of this hidden infrastructure. It existed in a parallel dimension, inhabited primarily by maintenance drones and the occasional repair technician. Their footsteps echoed in the cold corridors as they navigated through the bowels of the station. The temperature dropped as they moved deeper, the life support systems prioritizing inhabited areas over these seldom-used passages. Their breath fogged in the chill air, and frost formed on the metal surfaces where coolant lines ran close to the walls. An alarm suddenly blared. Security was closing in. "Someone betrayed us," Sarah hissed, drawing her blade. The weapon, crafted from a rare alloy that could penetrate most standard armors, gleamed dully in the emergency lighting. Unbeknownst to the group, an Orion named Derek, driven by fear, had secretly informed the administration of their plan. Years of persecution had broken his spirit, convincing him that collaboration was the only path to survival. He had approached Station Administrator Reeves with information about the resistance, hoping to secure safe passage for himself off Keras 9 before the purification protocol began. Reeves had promised him immunity and transportation to an Earth colony where he could live under an assumed identity. What Derek didn't know was that these promises were empty. Reeves had no intention of allowing any Orion to escape the purge. The moment Derek had provided the information, his fate was sealed. He now lay in a station holding cell, awaiting the same end he had hoped to avoid. When the team finally reached the control compartment, armed guards were waiting for them. Chaos erupted as the Orions engaged the security forces, their superior strength and speed giving them an advantage despite being outnumbered. The guards wore standard station security armor, reinforced synthetics designed to absorb impact, but vulnerable to the specialized cutting edges of Orion blades. The confined space worked to the Orion's advantage, preventing the guards from effectively using their ranged weapons without risk of hitting their own people. Eldridge shielded Bennett with his body as blaster fire erupted around them. A stray shot caught him in the shoulder, burning through flesh and muscle. He staggered but continued forward, determined to reach the control panel that would give them a fighting chance. The pain radiated through his body like liquid fire, each movement sending fresh waves of agony through his injured shoulder. The smell of his own burned flesh turned his stomach, but he forced himself to focus on the task at hand. The lives of everyone in their group, and particularly the small child clinging to his back, depended on his ability to override the station's environmental controls. "Are you hurt?" Bennett asked, her small hands feeling the wetness of blood on his coveralls. "Just a scratch," Eldred lied through gritted teeth. "We need to keep moving." The pain radiated through his body like liquid fire, but he forced himself to concentrate on the task at hand. Years of working in the station's maintenance sector had familiarized him with the control systems, but sabotaging them without triggering a catastrophic failure that would kill everyone on board required precision. He wasn't sure he could maintain with his injury. Sarah dispatched 2 guards with fluid efficiency, her blade finding the weak points in their armor with unerring accuracy. The Orion combat style emphasized speed and precision over brute force, targeting vulnerable areas with surgical precision. Each movement flowed into the next in a deadly dance that human combat training couldn't match. The remaining security forces fell back, calling for reinforcements through their comm units. They had minutes at most before they would be overwhelmed. "Hurry," Sarah urged, taking up a defensive position near the entrance. Eldred's fingers flew over the control panel, bypassing security protocols and rerouting critical systems. The interface was designed to prevent exactly the kind of sabotage he was attempting, with redundant systems and fail-safes that needed to be carefully circumvented. Under normal circumstances, the task would have required hours of careful work. With security reinforcements on the way, he had minutes at most. Bennett remained at his side, her acute hearing alerting him to approaching dangers that the others missed. The sonic mapper had become an extension of her senses, providing a 3-dimensional awareness of their surroundings that even the Orions with their superior vision couldn't match. "Guards coming through the ventilation shaft," she whispered, pointing to a seemingly solid wall panel. 3 of them, moving quickly. Sarah signaled to two of her companions, who positioned themselves on either side of the panel. When the first guard emerged, they were waiting, neutralizing the threat before an alarm could be raised. The element of surprise was their greatest advantage. Once it was lost, their small force would be quickly overwhelmed by the station's security personnel. The control room was a nexus of the station's various systems. Environmental, power, communications, and security all converged in this space. Monitors displayed real-time data from throughout Keras 9, showing life support parameters, power consumption metrics, and security feeds from key areas. Eldred focused on the environmental controls, specifically the atmospheric regulation systems for the administrative levels. "I need to create a cascading failure in the oxygen scrubbers," he explained to Sarah as his fingers continued their work. "It will force an evacuation of the upper levels without causing permanent damage." The distinction was important. While the Orions were fighting for their survival, they had no desire to inflict unnecessary casualties. Their quarrel was with Reeves and his policies, not with the civilian population of the station, who were in many ways as much victims of the administration as the Orions themselves. To evade their pursuers, the group was forced to traverse an emergency compartment with near-zero pressure. Eldred shared his single oxygen respirator with Bennett, placing it over her face first before taking quick gulps of air himself. The child clung to him with both hands, barely suppressing her tears as the cold vacuum pulled at their clothes and threatened to steal what little warmth remained in their bodies. The emergency compartment was a safety feature designed to contain hull breaches, a section that could be isolated from the rest of the station and depressurized in case of structural damage. In this case, it provided a shortcut to their objective, but at significant risk. Without proper vacuum suits, they were exposed to the deadly effects of decompression, rapidly dropping temperatures, the expansion of gases within body tissues, and most immediately, the lack of breathable air. The sensation of breathlessness was terrifying, a primal fear that no amount of preparation could mitigate. Bennett felt her lungs burning, her body screaming for oxygen. When Eldred passed her the respirator, she gulped the air greedily, then forced herself to pass it back, knowing his need was as great as hers. The cold was almost as dangerous as the lack of air. In the vacuum conditions, heat dissipated rapidly from their bodies. Bennett's small frame was particularly vulnerable to hypothermia, her hybrid physiology offering little protection against the plummeting temperature. Eldred wrapped her tightly in his outer layer, sacrificing his own comfort to preserve her body heat. They reached the final barrier, a manual override that needed to be activated from outside the station's main hull. Eldred could barely stand, his wound leaving a trail of blood behind them, but Bennett tugged at his sleeve. "The hidden node," she reminded him, recalling a junction box she had discovered during her scavenging. "The one I found in the market." Her small insight allowed them to bypass the system without triggering additional alarms. The junction box, overlooked in countless security upgrades due to its seemingly redundant nature, provided a backdoor access to the station's emergency protocols. By activating it, they could initiate an evacuation sequence without directly interfering with the life support systems, a solution that would create the diversion they needed while minimizing the risk to innocent lives. Sarah's team worked quickly to initiate the evacuation protocol that would allow them to escape before the administration could implement their deadly plan. The complexity of the station systems worked in their favor. Designed by multiple contractors over decades of expansion and modification, Keras 9's infrastructure was a patchwork of incompatible technologies and redundant systems that created vulnerabilities no security protocol could fully address. As they worked, Bennett's sonic mapper detected a familiar cadence of footsteps approaching, the heavy tread of Station Administrator Reeves himself, accompanied by his personal security detail. Unlike the regular security forces, Reeves's personal guard was composed of ex-military personnel with advanced combat training and equipment. They represented a threat of an entirely different magnitude. "They're coming," she warned, her voice tight with fear. "The administrator and at least 6 guards." Eldred and Sarah exchanged grim looks. They needed more time to complete the override sequence, time they no longer had. The evacuation protocol was initiated, but the commands were still propagating through the system. If Reeves reached them before the process completed, he could abort the sequence and trap them. "Take the child and go," Eldred told Sarah. "I'll hold them off." "You can barely stand," Sarah protested. The human's injury had worsened, his skin pale with blood loss and shock. That he was still functioning at all was a testament to his determination. I don't need to stand to trigger the emergency bulkheads. Eldred's voice was calm, resolved. It will seal them in this section and give you time to reach the ship. The plan was a suicide mission. Once the bulkheads closed, Eldred would be trapped with Reeves and his security team. Even at full strength, he would have no chance against such odds. Injured as he was, it was a death sentence. No, Bennett cried, clinging to Eldred's arm. You promised we'd stay together. The raw emotion in her voice, the first real outburst she had shown since he'd met her, struck Eldred like a physical blow. He knelt beside her, ignoring the pain that shot through his injured shoulder. Sometimes promises have to be broken to be kept in the long run, he said softly. I promise to keep you safe, and this is how I do that. Saira made a quick decision. There is another way. She turned to her companions. The resonance disruptor. It will incapacitate humans without harming us. The resonance disruptor was an Orion technology developed during the Resource Wars, a non-lethal weapon designed to temporarily disable human nervous systems by exploiting the different neurological structures of the two species. It had been banned under the terms of the armistice, its possession a serious violation of interspecies protocols. That the refugees had preserved such a device spoke to the precariousness of their existence and their foresight in preparing for worst-case scenarios. One of the Orions produced a small device from a pouch at his belt. It's not been tested on human Orion hybrids, he warned, glancing at Bennett. The effect on her mixed physiology is unpredictable. It's our only option, Sarah said, weighing the known risk of Eldred's sacrifice against the unknown risk to Bennett. Time was running out. Reeves' footsteps grew louder with each passing second. The device, when activated, emitted a frequency that attacked the human nervous system, causing temporary paralysis without permanent damage. The Orions, with their differently structured neural pathways, were immune to its effects. But Bennett, with her mixed heritage, was an unknown factor. Cover her ears, Sarah instructed Eldred, who immediately wrapped his hands protectively around Bennett's head. It was a futile gesture. The disruptor affected neural pathways directly, not through auditory channels, but it reflected his instinctive need to shield the child from harm. The disruptor activated with a high-pitched whine that quickly passed beyond human hearing range. When Reeves and his security team rounded the corner, they collapsed instantly, their limbs seizing as the frequency interfered with their neural impulses. Their weapons clattered to the floor, rendered useless by suddenly unresponsive fingers. Eldred felt a wave of dizziness, but remained conscious. The weapon had been calibrated for full-blooded humans, and his proximity to Bennett, protected by Sarah's positioning, had spared him the full effect. Bennett, however, cried out in pain, her body going rigid in his arms. For a terrifying moment, he thought they had lost her, but she gradually relaxed, though her breathing remained shallow. She'll recover, Sarah assured him, though uncertainty flickered in her eyes. We must move now. The evacuation protocol had successfully activated, triggering alarms throughout the administrative levels. Emergency lighting bathed the corridors in pulsing red as automated announcements directed personnel to designated evacuation points. The confusion created the perfect cover for their final objective, reaching the auxiliary docking bay where a maintenance vessel awaited. Explosions rocked the station as they made their way through increasingly chaotic corridors. The evacuation protocol had triggered emergency systems throughout Keras 9, causing cascading failures in critical infrastructure. The station was tearing itself apart, exactly as they had planned, but with an intensity they hadn't anticipated. The auxiliary docking bay was located in a seldom-used section of the station, originally designed for maintenance vessels, but largely abandoned when newer facilities were constructed. The ship that waited there was an old cargo hauler, officially decommissioned, but kept operational by the Orion refugees for precisely this contingency. Its systems were outdated but functional, sufficient for their escape, if not for comfort. Eldred summoned his last reserves of strength to carry Bennett into the airlock. Her small body felt alarmingly limp in his arms, her skin cool to the touch. The effects of the resonance disruptor had hit her hybrid physiology harder than they'd expected, temporarily shutting down non-essential functions to protect her vital systems. Sarah took control of the engines, and with a deafening roar, the ship broke free from Keras 9's gravitational ring just as the station began to tear itself apart from the inside. Through the viewport, they watched as sections of the station separated, venting atmosphere and debris into the void. Thousands of lives were aboard that station, not all of them complicit in the administration's genocidal plans. The weight of that knowledge settled heavily on them all. Will they survive? Eldred asked, his voice barely audible over the strain of the engines pushing beyond their design capacity. Syra's expression was grim but resolute. The evacuation pods deployed before we left. Most civilians should reach the emergency gathering points, Reeves and his security forces. She left the sentence unfinished, but her meaning was clear. Those responsible for the attempted genocide would likely perish in the chaos they had created. As the ship accelerated away from the disintegrating station, Bennett finally stirred in Eldred's arms. Her cloudy eyes opened, unfocused but searching. "Are we safe?" she whispered. "We're away from the station," Eldred answered carefully, "heading for a new place." It wasn't quite safety. They were fugitives in a stolen vessel with limited supplies and no clear destination. But they had escaped imminent death, and for now that would have to be enough. Bennett awoke fully in the ship's medical compartment hours later, the hum of engines a soothing backdrop to her disorientation. Her head throbbed with a dull pain, and her limbs felt unusually heavy. The sonic mapper was still clutched in her hand, its familiar vibrations grounding her in the unfamiliar surroundings. The medical compartment was small, originally designed for emergency treatment rather than extended care. The equipment was basic: a diagnostic scanner, a supply of common medications, and a single treatment bed. Like everything else on the cargo hauler, it was functional but far from luxurious. Eldred sat beside her, holding her small hand in his. His shoulder was bandaged, but his eyes were clear and focused on her face. Relief washed over his features when she stirred. "We made it," he said softly. Bennett reached out tentatively, her fingers tracing the outline of his face, mapping his features in the way of her people. "You're hurt," she said, finding the lines of pain etched around his eyes. "Nothing that won't heal," he assured her. "How do you feel?" She considered the question seriously. Physical pain was something she understood well. It had been a constant companion throughout her life. But the emotional landscape she now navigated was unfamiliar territory. Fear, yes, that was an old friend. But there was something else, something warm that bloomed in her chest when Eldred spoke to her, when he held her hand, when he had risked everything to protect her. "Different," she finally answered. Syra entered, her tall form ducking under the human-sized doorframe. A deep gash crossed her left arm, hastily bandaged but still seeping blue fluid. Orion physiology was remarkably resilient. Their cellular structure allowed for rapid healing and resistance to infection. But even they had limits. The wound would leave a scar, another mark in the collection that mapped Sarah's history of survival against overwhelming odds. "Course is set for the distant colony of Hivara," she announced. "Humans and Orions alike will find a new beginning there." Hivara was a legend among refugees, a frontier world far from protectorate control, where a coalition of species had established a society based on cooperation rather than dominance. Its location was a closely guarded secret, passed through whispered networks of those seeking escape from persecution. That Syra possessed the coordinates spoke to her connections within the refugee underground. Bennett said nothing, her cloudy eyes turned toward the viewport where endless stars streamed by in ribbons of light she would never see. In her pocket, she clutched the metal plate, her first and most important survival trophy. But now it represented something more. Not just survival, but hope. "What will happen to me?" she finally asked, her voice small against the vastness of space surrounding them. Eldred squeezed her hand gently. "You'll never have to scavenge alone again," he promised. "From now on, we face whatever comes together." It was a significant commitment, not just temporary protection, but a permanent bond. Eldred was offering her something she had never had: a family, a place of belonging, a future beyond day-to-day survival. Syra placed a blue-skinned hand on the child's shoulder. On Hivara, blindness is not considered a disability. The native species communicates through touch and sound. You may find yourself at an advantage rather than a disadvantage. For the first time in her short, harsh life, Bennett felt something unfamiliar bloom in her chest, something warm and expanding that pushed against the cold fear she had carried for so long. It took her a moment to recognize it as belonging. Days stretched into weeks as the ship traveled through the void between stars. The cargo hauler, designed for short transport runs between neighboring systems, strained under the demands of deep space travel. Systems failed regularly, requiring constant attention from both Eldred and the Orion engineers. The life support system, calibrated for a crew of 5, struggled to maintain optimal conditions for the 23 refugees aboard. Oxygen levels were kept deliberately low to conserve resources, leaving everyone slightly lightheaded. Water was rationed carefully, each person allotted just enough to survive. Food supplies, hastily gathered during their escape, dwindled alarmingly despite strict rationing. During this time, Eldred taught Bennett about the ship's systems, guiding her hands over control panels and explaining how each component functioned. She absorbed everything with remarkable speed, her mind mapping the invisible world around her with increasing confidence. "Why are you teaching me these things?" she asked one day as they sat in the engine room, her fingers tracing the outline of a power coupling. Eldred was silent for a moment, his hands continuing their work on a malfunctioning regulator. "Because knowledge is the one thing no one can take from you," he finally said. "No matter what happens, what you know stays with you." It was a lesson he had learned the hard way after losing his family. All his possessions, his status, his position, all gone in an instant. But his knowledge had remained, allowing him to rebuild some semblance of a life from the ashes of his loss. "What if I forget?" Bennett asked, her voice small. "Some things become part of you," Eldred replied. "They change how you think, how you solve problems. Even if you forget the specific facts, the understanding remains." This perspective was new to Bennett. On Karis 9, her focus had been exclusively on immediate survival, finding food, avoiding danger, securing shelter. The concept of learning for future benefit, of knowledge as a form of security, was revolutionary. The Orions, initially wary of the human child, soon came to respect her unique abilities. Syra began training Bennett in the basics of self-defense, teaching her to use her other senses to anticipate an opponent's movements. These training sessions took place in the cargo hold, the only space large enough for physical activity. The metal floor was cold beneath Bennett's bare feet, but the contact helped her sense vibrations that telegraphed Sarah's movements. The sonic mapper provided additional information, creating a three-dimensional awareness of her surroundings that compensated for her lack of vision. "Your blindness is your strength," Sarah told her during one session. "You do not depend on light to see danger approaching." The Orion warrior demonstrated techniques specifically adapted for someone without sight, movements that emphasize using an opponent's momentum against them, sensing attacks through air pressure changes, and targeting vulnerable areas by touch rather than sight. "In darkness, a sighted opponent is handicapped, but you remain unchanged," Sarah explained. "Remember this if you are ever pursued." These training sessions revealed another aspect of Bennett's hybrid nature, a natural agility and faster reflexes than most human children her age. Though small and malnourished, she possessed an inherent grace that Syra recognized as distinctly Orion. "Who were my parents?" Bennett asked during one such session, the question emerging unexpectedly as they practiced a defensive stance. Syra's movements faltered briefly. "I cannot know for certain," she said carefully, "but your features suggest your Orion parent may have been from the eastern provinces of our world. The people there have a similar bone structure to yours. Why did they leave me?" The question was asked without self-pity, merely a child's natural curiosity about her origins. Sarah knelt beside her, placing both hands on Bennett's shoulders in the Orion gesture of respect. "Not all separations are by choice, little one. Our people were scattered across the stars when our homeworld fell. Many families were torn apart in the chaos." The explanation was kind but did little to fill the empty spaces in Bennett's history. Still, it gave her something she had never possessed before, a connection to a larger story, a heritage beyond the cold corridors of Karis 9. A month into their journey, the ship's sensors detected an anomaly, a massive debris field blocking their path. The remnants of an ancient battle, the field was impossible to navigate visually due to microscopic fragments that could pierce the hull. The debris field was a graveyard of vessels from the resource wars, a conflict that had raged through this sector a century earlier. Shattered warships, destroyed civilian transports, and the remnants of space stations formed a lethal maze extending for millions of kilometers in all directions. The microscopic fragments were particularly dangerous, too small to detect with standard sensors, but capable of penetrating hull materials through sheer velocity. "We must go around," Sarah declared after consulting the navigational computer. "It will add weeks to our journey." This announcement caused concern among both humans and Orions. Their supplies were already stretched thin, and the ship's life support systems were operating at reduced capacity to conserve power. Additional weeks in space might prove fatal, But Bennett, who had been sitting quietly beside the sensor array, spoke up. "The debris makes sounds," she said. "Different pieces hit each other with different tones. There's a pattern, a pathway." The others looked at her with skepticism. The sensor technician, an Orion named Vrel, explained gently, "The sensors detect the larger pieces, but the microfragments are too small. That's what makes it dangerous." "I don't mean the sensors," Bennett insisted. "I can hear it. The actual impacts. There's a rhythm to it, like music with spaces in between." What Bennett was describing seemed impossible. The vacuum of space couldn't transmit sound in the conventional sense. But Eldred, who had learned to trust the child's unusual perceptions, suggested, could she be detecting vibrations in the ship's hull? Micro-impacts too small to register on instruments, but creating resonance patterns. Vrel considered this, then adjusted the sensitivity of the sensor array. "There is something, very faint energy patterns in the distribution of the debris, but interpreting it would require—" "Let her try," Eldred urged. Skeptical but desperate to maintain their schedule, Sarah allowed Bennett to guide them, her small hands resting on the audio sensors, her head tilted in concentration as she directed minor course corrections based solely on the symphony of collisions that only she could interpret. The process was painstaking, requiring hours of focused attention as Bennett translated the complex patterns of sound into navigational instructions. Eldred remained by her side throughout, bringing her water and nutrients when she refused to take breaks, supporting her when exhaustion made her sway on her feet. "Just a little further," he would murmur when her concentration faltered. "You're doing something no one else could do." The navigation challenge became increasingly complex as they penetrated deeper into the debris field. What had initially appeared as a relatively straightforward pattern revealed itself as an intricate, multi-layered composition of interactions. Bennett's brow furrowed with effort as she struggled to maintain her awareness of the whole while focusing on the immediate path ahead. The strain took its toll. By the third day of navigation through the debris field, Bennett collapsed, her small body finally surrendering to the demands placed upon it. Eldred carried her to the medical bay, his face etched with concern as the ship's rudimentary medical scanner assessed her condition. "Extreme neural fatigue," the Orion medic reported. "Her brain has been processing sensory input at an accelerated rate for too long. She needs rest." For 2 days, Bennett drifted in and out of consciousness, her dreams filled with the music of colliding debris and the deep, resonant voices of stars dying in the distance. When she finally awoke fully, Eldred was asleep in a chair beside her bed, his hand still holding hers. The lines of worry etched into his face even in sleep testified to his vigil during her collapse. The ship had successfully traversed the debris field during her convalescence, guided by the course she had plotted. Against all odds, they had emerged unscathed, saving precious fuel and time. That night, Sarah knelt before Bennett in a formal Orion gesture of respect, warrior to warrior. "The treasure you collected was never in the metal," she said, touching Bennett's forehead in blessing. "It was in how you learned to see without seeing." The gesture, performed in front of the entire ship's company, marked a turning point in Bennett's life. No longer was she merely a burden to be protected. She had become a valued member of their community, her unique perspectives and abilities recognized and honored. The metal plate she had scavenged on Karis 9, once her most precious possession, now seemed trivial compared to the connection she had formed with these people who saw her true value. As they approached Havara, the ship's communications picked up disturbing news. The colony was under blockade by mercenary forces hired by the same corporation that had controlled Karis 9. They had arrived ahead of the refugees, determined to eliminate witnesses to their attempted genocide. The mercenary vessels were military-grade, heavily armed and shielded, a stark contrast to the refugees' unarmed cargo hauler. Their presence suggested that the events on Karis 9 were part of a larger operation, not an isolated incident of xenophobia. Someone with significant resources was working to eliminate the Orion population throughout the sector and was willing to pursue survivors across vast distances. "We can't turn back," Eldred said, studying the tactical display. "We don't have enough supplies to reach another habitable system." Sarah nodded grimly. "Then we fight." The cargo hauler was no match for the military vessels surrounding Havara, but what they lacked in firepower, they made up for in determination in Bennett's unique abilities. She had spent the journey learning the sounds of different engine types, the subtle vibrations that preceded weapons discharge, the patterns of communication frequencies used by military vessels. They're using automated targeting systems, she announced after listening to the enemy communications. They follow heat signatures and movement patterns. This insight gave Eldred an idea. Using his engineering knowledge, he modified the ship's thermal shields to create false heat signatures that confuse the enemy targeting systems. By projecting multiple phantom images of their vessel, they could divide the mercenaries' attention and create opportunities to slip past their blockade. Meanwhile, Bennett helped identify gaps in the blockade by interpreting the communication chatter between enemy vessels. The mercenaries operated on standard military protocols, rotating their patrol patterns at predictable intervals. These patterns, invisible to conventional observation, became clear to Bennett through the rhythms of their communications and engine signatures. Their desperate gambit succeeded. They slipped through the blockade with only minor damage to the outer hull. As they entered Havara's atmosphere, cheers erupted throughout the ship. Syra embraced Eldred, their former distrust dissolved by shared struggle and victory. The colony welcomed them with open arms, grateful for the warning about the corporate forces and impressed by their daring escape. The residents, a mix of human settlers and indigenous species, had already begun preparations to defend their world from the approaching threat. Havara itself was unlike anything Bennett could have imagined. The planet's atmosphere was richer in oxygen than Earth standard, creating a natural high that first-time visitors often found disorienting. Its gravity was slightly lower, making movements feel effortless after the confines of the ship. But most striking was the planet's unique soundscape, a complex tapestry of natural harmonies created by wind flowing through crystalline rock formations and the calls of native fauna that communicated through melodic sequences. Bennett stood on the surface of her new home, feeling the strange gravity pull at her limbs and the unfamiliar breeze against her face. The sonic mapper revealed a landscape unlike anything she had experienced. Open spaces that extended beyond the device's range, natural formations with complex geometries, and the movement of creatures whose biology was utterly alien to her limited experience. Beside her, Eldred watched as she explored her surroundings with outstretched hands, touching the rough bark of alien trees and the smooth stones of buildings constructed from local materials. The settlement was small but growing, a collection of structures that blended introduced technology with native materials. The architecture reflected the diverse backgrounds of the colonists, with elements from multiple cultures adapted to the local conditions. "Is it beautiful?" she asked him, her fingers tracing the outline of a flowering plant that emitted a soft, musical hum when touched. "It's the most beautiful place I've ever seen," Eldred replied honestly, "but not as beautiful as watching you discover it." In the following months, Bennett found her place within the colony. The local species, as Syra had predicted, communicated primarily through sound and touch, making Bennett's blindness irrelevant. The Heverans, tall, slender beings with translucent skin that revealed the complex circulatory systems beneath, had evolved in the deep forest regions where light rarely penetrated. Their society was built around acoustic principles, with structures designed to carry sound in specific patterns and social interactions governed by complex harmonic exchanges. Bennett became a bridge between the newcomers and the indigenous population, her sensitivity to non-visual cues making her an ideal translator. She learned the basics of the Heveran language quickly, her ear attuned to the subtle tonal variations that carried meaning beyond the literal translation of words. Eldred established himself as an engineer, using his skills to improve the colony's defenses and infrastructure. His experience maintaining the aging systems of Keras 9 proved invaluable in adapting Earth and Orient technology to work with Heveran materials and power sources. The metal plate that Bennett had salvaged from Keras 9 now hung in their shared dwelling, a reminder of how far they had come and the strength they had discovered in each other. The corporate forces eventually arrived, just as they had feared, but found a united colony prepared for their assault. Humans, Orions, and indigenous species fought side by side, their combined strengths overwhelming the mercenary forces that had expected to find easy targets. The battle lasted for 3 days, raging across the fertile plains surrounding the main settlement. Bennett, despite Eldred's protests, used her abilities to monitor enemy communications and predict their movements. From a secured bunker deep beneath the colony's central hub, she directed defense forces to vulnerable points in the mercenaries' formation, her sonic mapper translating battlefield sounds into tactical advantages. On the second day, Disaster struck when a mercenary scout team discovered the bunker's location. Eldred, who had refused to leave Bennett's side despite the need for his engineering skills elsewhere, found himself facing armed intruders with nothing but a makeshift spear fashioned from local hardwood. "Stay behind me," he told Bennett, his voice steady despite the fear churning in his gut. But Bennett had other ideas. Using the techniques Sarah had taught her, she moved silently to a position behind the mercenaries as they focused on Eldred. With precise movements, she activated the control panel near the door, triggering the emergency lockdown sequence. Metal barriers slammed down, separating two of the mercenaries from their companions and trapping them in the narrow corridor with Bennett and Eldred. The fight was brief but violent. Eldred's spear found its mark in one mercenary's chest, while Bennett used the sonic mapper to disrupt the other's equilibrium, sending him crashing into a wall with enough force to render him unconscious. "Are you hurt?" Eldred demanded, quickly checking her for injuries. "No," Bennett replied, her voice remarkably calm. "But there are more coming. We need to move." They escaped through a maintenance tunnel that Bennett had discovered during her explorations of the colony's underground network. Her habit of mapping unfamiliar spaces had not diminished since leaving Karis 9. By the third day, the mercenary forces were in retreat, their superior weaponry negated by the defenders' intimate knowledge of the terrain and their unified resistance. As the last enemy ships disappeared into Heveraz's upper atmosphere, the colony erupted in celebration. In the aftermath of the battle, as the community gathered to rebuild damaged structures and heal their wounded, Bennett sat with Eldred and Sarah under the twin moons of Hevera. Though she couldn't see the celestial bodies that bathed them in silver light, she felt their presence in the rhythmic tides of the nearby ocean and the subtle changes in temperature as clouds passed overhead. "Do you miss seeing the stars?" Sarah asked her, curious about the human experience of blindness. Bennett considered the question carefully before answering. "I don't miss what I've never had," she said, "but I've found something better than sight." "What's that?" Eldred prompted. Bennett reached out, taking both their hands in hers, one human, one Orion, both equally dear to her. "I've found people who see me. Not just my blindness, but all of me. That's worth more than all the stars in the sky." As the settlement grew and prospered, stories spread throughout the colony of the blind girl who had once collected trash for survival and now helped guide an entire community. Children sought her out for her tales of adventure and her uncanny ability to identify anyone by the sound of their footsteps alone. Adults came for her wisdom, the unique perspective of one who navigated the world differently. Years passed, and Bennett grew into a young woman of remarkable capability and compassion. The metal plate from Karis 9 had been fashioned into a pendant that she wore against her heart, no longer trash, but a symbol of transformation. One evening, as the community celebrated the anniversary of their victory against the corporate forces, an elderly member of the indigenous species approached Bennett. In halting human speech, the elder explained that their people had a tradition of honoring those who bridged worlds. "You see without eyes," the elder said, placing a ceremonial circlet of resonant crystals on Bennett's head. "You taught us that true vision comes from within." The crystals, which responded to the neural patterns of the wearer, began to glow with a soft blue light that pulsed in rhythm with Bennett's heartbeat. It was said that these crystals revealed the inner nature of those who wore them, their light reflecting the strength of the wearer's spirit. Bennett accepted the honor with grace, but later that night she sought out Eldred, who had become the father she had never known. "Everything I am began with you," she told him, her voice thick with emotion. "You saw value in me when everyone else saw only a burden." Eldred embraced her, his voice equally affected. "You saved us as much as we saved you. Never forget that." As they stood together under the alien sky, surrounded by the sounds of their thriving community, Bennett reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From the cold corridors of Karis 9 to this warm world of possibility, from scavenging trash to building a future, it had all begun with one person choosing to see treasure where others saw nothing of value. And in that realization lay the most powerful truth of all, that sometimes the greatest act of courage is simply to recognize the worth in another soul, to extend a hand in the darkness, and to walk together into whatever light awaits.